My name is Trevor Saberland, and by the time I turned 55, I had developed what I considered a healthy distrust of official explanations. Not because I believed in conspiracies exactly, but because I had spent 31 years as a journalist in Western Canada watching ordinary institutions hide embarrassing truths behind words like maintenance, seasonal adjustment, habitat protection, administrative review, and public safety. Those words had a smell to them after a while. They were not always lies, but they were often curtains. So when I first heard that Blackwater Ridge Provincial Park closed one particular hiking trail every autumn without explaining why, I did not imagine monsters or ghosts or anything so dramatic. I imagined liability, probably. A dangerous bridge, a bear corridor, a sinkhole the ministry had not budgeted to repair. Maybe an old logging road contaminated by some forgotten industrial mess no one wanted tied to a tourism brochure. The world is usually disappointing before it is terrifying, and at my age I had come to expect disappointment. Terror, as it turned out, had merely been waiting for me to become cynical enough not to recognize it when it opened the gate. The trail was called Alder Trail, though that name appeared on older maps more often than on newer ones. In park literature, it had been gradually reduced over the years from a featured backcountry route to a faint gray line near the northeastern boundary, then to a dotted seasonal access path, then to nothing at all on the latest brochure handed out at the visitor center by a summer student who smiled too brightly and told me, without my asking, that most people preferred the lake loop because it had excellent views and interpretive signage. I had driven 5 hours from Edmonton after receiving a tip from a retired conservation officer named Len Harker, who had called me at home 2 nights earlier using the kind of voice men use when they have decided to say something they should have said years ago. He did not give me much, only that Alder Trail closed every year on the same date, the second Friday after Labor Day, always at 4 in the afternoon, always before the first frost, and always with no public notice beyond a small wooden barricade and a laminated sign reading temporary closure. When I asked what made that unusual, he laughed once, not pleasantly, and said, "Because nothing temporary happens for 28 years. That was enough for me. Not enough for a story, obviously, not even enough for a column, but enough to bother me. I had built an entire career on being bothered. I had covered municipal budgets, mining disputes, flood inquiries, rural hospital closures, wildfire evacuations, wrongful dismissals, school board scandals, and one memorable case involving a mayor, 2 missing snowplows, and a woman named Darlene, who bred miniature donkeys outside Red Deer. Most of journalism was not glamour. It was persistence. It was noticing the sentence someone repeated too carefully. It was driving long distances to ask questions no one powerful considered worth answering. By then I was no longer a star reporter, if I had ever been one. Newspapers had shrunk, newsrooms had become ghost towns with Slack channels, and younger editors increasingly treated men like me as archival furniture. But I still knew how to follow a thread. Alder Trail was a thread. Blackwater Ridge looked harmless when I arrived just after noon. That may have been the first unsettling thing about it. The park was beautiful in the soft, marketable way provincial parks are often beautiful near their front entrances: paved pullouts, clean outhouses, bear-proof garbage bins, cheerful signs showing cartoon hikers beside warnings about cougars, hypothermia, and leaving no trace. Families were eating sandwiches beside a lake that reflected the mountains in slightly distorted blue and white. Retirees with trekking poles moved along the easy path near the water. A little boy in a dinosaur hoodie pointed at a raven and shouted that it was an eagle while his father agreed because fathers on vacation often choose peace over accuracy. Nothing about the place suggested secrecy. Nothing suggested danger beyond the usual wilderness dangers everyone photographs and then ignores. At the visitor center I introduced myself honestly, which was sometimes a mistake but usually saved time. The young woman at the desk looked at my press card with polite confusion, as though I had shown her a library card from a country that no longer existed. Her name tag read, Maya. She could not have been more than 22. When I asked about Alder Trail, her smile did not vanish, but it did become institutional. "That area is not recommended for visitors at this time," she said. I asked why. She said trail conditions varied seasonally. I asked whether there had been a washout. She said maintenance assessments were ongoing. I asked whether wildlife activity had increased. She said the park always encouraged visitors to remain bear-aware. I asked when the trail would reopen. She said closures were reviewed periodically. By then I could practically see the laminated training sheet behind her eyes. I thanked her, took the free map she offered, and was halfway to the door when she called after me in a different voice, quieter and almost unwilling. "You shouldn't go up there today." I turned back. She looked immediately embarrassed, as though surprised by her own words. Behind her, a rack of postcards showed sunsets, waterfalls, and smiling hikers who had clearly never received advice from frightened park staff. I asked her whether something had happened on the trail. She glanced toward the office door behind the counter. It was closed, but not fully. Someone inside shifted in a chair. "It closes at 4, she said, returning to the official voice. "The gate is locked after that." I asked who locked it. She said, "Operations." I asked whether I could speak to operations. She said no one was available. That was the second thing that bothered me. In rural parks, someone is almost always available if the question is ordinary. Unavailability is a kind of answer. I left the visitor center and sat in my old Subaru for several minutes, watching clouds gather over the ridgeline. I could have gone home then. I tell myself that sometimes. I could have written a small piece about bureaucratic secrecy and seasonal trail closures without ever setting foot on Alder Trail. But that would have been dishonest, and despite all my disappointments with the profession, I still believed reporting required proximity. You had to stand where the thing happened, smell the air, read the signs, see whether your own unease survived contact with the facts. I drove past the main campground, past the Lake Loop parking area, then onto a narrower service road that the map claimed led to a decommissioned picnic site. The pavement ended after 2 kilometers. Gravel followed, then dirt. The forest grew thicker, darker, older looking than the friendly lodgepole stands near the entrance. The mountains pressed closer. By the time I reached the Alder Trail parking area, there were no other vehicles. The gate stood at the edge of the trees, open but waiting. That is the best way I can describe it. A heavy green metal bar stretched between 2 posts, currently swung aside and chained to one of them. Beside it stood a wooden sign darkened by years of rain. Alder Trail, it read, though someone had scratched deep lines across the letters until the name seemed partly erased. Beneath it hung the laminated closure notice Len had mentioned. Temporary closure, effective 4 p.m. today. No public access beyond this point, by order of park operations. There was no explanation, no hazard listed, no reopening date, no emergency contact beyond the general park number. I checked my watch. 1:37 p.m., a little over 2 hours before the gate closed. Not enough time to hike the full route, but enough to walk in, look around, take photographs, and return before anyone could accuse me of trespassing. Reasonable, professional, practically dull. I stepped out of the car into air that felt noticeably colder than it had at the visitor center. The forest smelled of wet leaves and cedar rot. Somewhere above, ravens moved invisibly through the canopy, their wings making soft, leathery sounds. I put on a light jacket, clipped my recorder to the strap of my bag, checked that my phone had battery though not much signal, and took several photographs of the gate and sign. While I was doing that, a white parked truck appeared on the service road behind me without my hearing it approach. It rolled to a stop beside my Subaru. A man in his late 60s got out slowly, wearing a green jacket without a name badge. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent most of his life outdoors and the posture of someone who no longer wasted movement. "You're the reporter," he said. I admitted that I was. He looked past me toward the open trailhead. "Len called you." That surprised me enough that I did not answer immediately. He nodded as though my silence confirmed it. I asked if he knew Len Harker. The man gave a small, humorless smile. Everybody knew Len. I asked his name. He said, "Gordon Vale." I asked whether he worked for the park. He looked at the truck, then at his jacket, then back at me with the exhausted patience of a man who disliked unnecessary questions. "Long enough," he said. I asked him why Alder Trail closed every autumn. For the first time, his expression changed. Not dramatically, not in any way I could have used in a story. But something in his eyes hardened, and underneath that hardness I saw fear, old fear. the kind that had lived with him so long it had become part of his face. "Because people go stupid in the fall," he said. "They chase colors, they wander. They think a trail is safe because somebody once put it on a map." I asked whether there had been deaths. "People die in parks," he said. I asked whether people had died on Alder Trail specifically. He looked at the open gate again. "Not officially." That phrase stayed with me. Not officially. I took out my notebook. He noticed and almost laughed. "Put that away. I'm not giving you quotes." I told him I could keep it off the record. He said, "You newspaper boys always say that before deciding the public interest needs a little help." I would have argued if he had been wrong. Instead, I put the notebook away. He seemed to appreciate that, or at least accept it as the first sensible thing I had done. For several seconds, we stood there listening to the forest. It was not silent exactly, but the sounds were sparse and distant. No traffic reached us from the main road. No campers shouted. No dogs barked. Alder Trail seemed to begin at the gate and enter not merely a different section of park, but a different mood of the world. Gordon stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Walk to the first bridge if you have to prove something to yourself. Take your pictures, then come back. Don't go past the bridge. Don't leave the trail. And if you hear someone calling from the Alder Flats, no matter what they say, no matter who they sound like, you keep walking back to your car." I studied him, trying to determine whether he was warning me, threatening me, or testing how gullible I was. Who would be calling from the Alder Flats? No one you can help. The answer landed strangely because he said it without drama. I had interviewed grieving parents who used more guarded voices. He was not performing mystery. He was stating policy. I asked him what happened after 4. He pulled a key ring from his jacket pocket. Several keys hung from it, including one large brass key so worn it had become almost smooth. "After 4, he said. "The gate closes." I asked whether he would lock me in if I was late. He looked at me for a long moment. "No," he said. "If you're still in there after 4, the gate won't be your problem." Then he got back into his truck, reversed slowly, and drove away, leaving me alone with the open gate and the scratched sign and the dark trail waiting beyond it. Any reasonable man would have recognized that conversation as sufficient warning, but journalism is built on unreasonable men and women walking toward things others would prefer remain undisturbed. I told myself Gordon Vale was old, superstitious, perhaps protecting a long-standing embarrassment. I told myself Len Harker had called because he wanted exactly this, someone willing to push past the first layer of intimidation. I told myself I had 2 hours, good boots, a working phone, decades of backcountry experience, and the common sense to turn around at the first bridge. So I stepped past the gate. Alder Trail began gently, almost pleasantly, descending through a stand of yellowing aspen, whose leaves trembled in the light wind with a sound like paper being shuffled by unseen hands. The path was narrower than I expected, but still clear, carpeted with damp needles and bordered by ferns beginning to brown at the edges. At first the walk seemed ordinary enough that I felt faintly embarrassed by my own tension. I recorded a few observations into the microphone, describing the trail condition, the closure sign, the encounter with the unnamed park employee, though, of course, I named him for my own files. My voice sounded calm when I played back a few seconds. Professional. Slightly amused. A man gathering color for a minor investigation. After 10 minutes, the aspens gave way to alder. I understood then why the trail had its name. The shrubs crowded in from both sides, tall, tangled, and dense, their smooth gray stems leaning across the path until in places I had to duck beneath them. Their leaves were broad and wet, brushing against my shoulders and leaving dark marks on my jacket. The temperature dropped another few degrees. The smell changed as well, becoming richer and muddier, as though stagnant water lay hidden somewhere nearby. The trail underfoot softened. My boots began sinking slightly into black earth. I checked my watch. 2:04 p.m., plenty of time. Then I heard the first voice. It came from somewhere ahead and to my left, faint, distorted by the alder thicket. "Hello?" I stopped. The word had been so soft I almost convinced myself it was a bird call or a branch rubbing against another branch. I listened. The alders swayed gently. Water dripped from leaves. Somewhere far behind me, a raven croaked once. I called out, "Is someone there?" No answer. I stood for perhaps half a minute, then resumed walking, irritated with myself and with Gordon Vale for planting theatrical suggestions in my head. But after another 20 steps, the voice came again, closer this time. "Trevor?" My body reacted before my mind did. A coldness moved from the base of my skull down my spine so quickly that I stopped mid-step. The trail ahead curved into a tunnel of alder branches. Nothing moved there. No person stood between the stems. No jacket flashed through the leaves. Yet someone had said my name. I know what I heard. Not loudly. Not clearly enough to identify. But unmistakably. Trevor Saberland? The second time was worse because it carried something like amusement. I turned immediately and looked back the way I had come. The trail behind me remained empty, though already it seemed darker than it should have, as if the alders had leaned together after I passed. For one humiliating moment I considered calling Gordon. Then I remembered my phone had no signal. I stood there with my recorder still running, my breath shallow, my hand resting on the strap of my bag, while somewhere deep in the alder flats, a voice I did not recognize began quietly humming a tune my mother used to sing when I was a boy. That was when I understood the story was no longer about a trail closure. It was about why the gate had been left open long enough for someone like me to walk through. I have replayed those first few minutes on Alder Trail so many times that I no longer trust my own memory completely. Trauma has a way of polishing certain moments until they gleam brighter than reality, while allowing everything around them to fade into shadow. The voice humming my mother's lullaby remains perfectly clear even now, every note carrying through those damp alders, with an intimacy that still makes the back of my neck tighten whenever I think about it. Yet I cannot tell you whether the wind was blowing at that exact moment, or whether the clouds had already covered the sun, or even which boot I moved first when I finally forced myself to keep walking. I only know that I did keep walking, and if there is a single quality that defined most of my career as a journalist, it was an almost pathological unwillingness to retreat simply because something refused to make sense. Rational people often mistake skepticism for courage. It isn't. Skepticism is simply arrogance wearing sensible shoes. I believed there had to be an explanation waiting somewhere farther up the trail, and I had spent too many years exposing ordinary truths, hiding beneath extraordinary rumors, to turn around simply because someone or something had managed to say my name. The humming stopped the instant I began moving again, not gradually, not as though whoever produced it had wandered deeper into the brush. It simply ceased between one footstep and the next, leaving behind a silence so complete that I found myself slowing almost involuntarily. Alder has a peculiar way of muffling the world. The thick stems absorb sound rather than reflecting it, and the broad leaves soften even your own movements until walking through an alder flat feels strangely disconnected from the surrounding forest. I could still hear my breathing, the soft crunch of damp soil beneath my boots, and occasionally the distant complaint of a raven somewhere beyond the shrubs, but everything else seemed wrapped in layers of wet cloth. It occurred to me then that if someone truly were standing only 20 or 30 meters inside that thicket, I might never see them unless they chose to step onto the trail. That realization bothered me more than the voice itself. Human beings are surprisingly comfortable with mystery as long as it remains visible. Hidden mystery has a different weight altogether. I stopped once more and took out my recorder. The tiny red light blinked reassuringly as I pressed the button. 2:08 p.m., I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Approximately 1 kilometer beyond the Alder Trail gate. Heard what appeared to be a human voice calling my name from the alder flats east of the trail. Unable to identify source. No visual confirmation. I paused, listening. Possibly another hiker. Acoustic conditions unusual due to vegetation. Even as I spoke the words, I recognized them for what they were. They were not observations. They were negotiations. Journalists, scientists, police officers. We all do the same thing when confronted with something uncomfortable. We begin editing reality into language we can file. The trail curved gently downhill toward a small creek that crossed beneath a weathered wooden footbridge. Gordon Vale had told me not to go beyond the first bridge. Standing there, with its simple cedar railings darkened by decades of rain and its planks slick with moss, I suddenly understood why he had chosen such an ordinary landmark. There was nothing remarkable about it. That made it memorable. It represented a line, not because the bridge itself mattered, but because someone had decided it did. I stood at the near end for several minutes studying the surrounding forest. The creek beneath flowed quietly through black mud and tangled roots before disappearing beneath dense alder on both sides. Beyond the bridge, the trail climbed gently into thicker timber where spruce and cedar gradually replaced the shrubs. It looked no different from countless other backcountry trails I had walked over the years. Beautiful, slightly neglected, entirely ordinary. That was precisely the problem. If Gordon had warned me away from a cliff edge, a washed-out bridge, or obvious bear activity, I would have understood. But warning someone away from an ordinary bridge suggested that whatever lay beyond could not be explained by anything visible from where I stood. My professional instincts argued that crossing it was essential. My common sense argued just as strongly that I had already collected enough for one day's story. Interview with park staff, suspicious closure policy, unexplained warning, mysterious voice. Any editor would have accepted that much as the beginning of a feature article. I actually turned halfway back toward the trailhead before stopping again. The bridge remained behind me, quiet and unimpressive beneath the overcast sky. Then I noticed something I should have seen immediately. There were no footprints. The damp soil leading to the bridge preserved tracks beautifully. My own boot prints stretched clearly behind me through the mud. Deer tracks crossed near the creek. A raccoon had wandered along the bank during the previous night. Yet beyond the bridge, the trail remained almost untouched. Not empty, untouched. There were no recent boot prints leading away from the bridge, none leading toward it. The surface looked as though no human being had crossed there for days, despite the gate still standing open, less than a kilometer behind me. I knelt for a closer look. The mud confirmed what my eyes already suspected. My prints were the only fresh human tracks on that side. Someone maintained the trail. Someone locked the gate every autumn. Someone had spoken my name. Yet apparently no one had walked beyond the bridge. A journalist learns to pay attention whenever facts begin contradicting one another. I crossed. The bridge creaked softly beneath my weight, the old cedar flexing just enough to remind me of its age. Halfway across, I stopped and looked downstream. The creek wound lazily through alder thickets where fallen branches formed natural barriers against the current. Nothing moved except water. Upstream, the channel narrowed between moss-covered rocks before disappearing beneath overhanging cedar limbs. Again, nothing. I reached the opposite bank and immediately felt something I struggled then, and still struggle now, to describe accurately. It was not fear exactly, nor relief. More like the subtle sensation of entering a room where an important conversation has just ended. The forest beyond the bridge possessed the same trees, the same smells, the same cool September air, yet the atmosphere had shifted almost imperceptibly. Even the light seemed flatter somehow, drained of warmth despite the clouds remaining unchanged overhead. The trail climbed steadily now, leaving the alder flats behind. Spruce trunks thickened around me. Moss covered everything not directly exposed to the sky. Here and there, ancient cedars rose from the forest floor like weathered pillars supporting the canopy. I found myself walking more slowly, not because the terrain demanded it, but because my attention had become divided between the trail ahead and the woods on either side. Several times I caught movement in my peripheral vision only to discover nothing more than dripping branches settling after the breeze passed. I laughed once at myself, quietly enough that the sound seemed inappropriate. Fear has a remarkable talent for recruiting imagination into its service. Perhaps 15 minutes beyond the bridge, I found the first marker. It had once been a standard provincial park trail post, about chest high, carved from cedar and painted dark green. Time had worn most of the paint away. The distance marker was no longer readable. What drew my attention instead were the deep cuts carved into one side. They had not been made by weather, nor by bears sharpening claws. Someone had deliberately cut 7 vertical lines into the wood, each precisely the same length, each separated by exactly the same distance. Beside them, someone else, or perhaps the same person years later, had attempted to scrape them away with a knife, leaving rough, pale scars across the original cuts without quite succeeding. The result looked less like vandalism than disagreement. I photographed the marker from several angles. When I lowered the camera, I realized someone was standing farther up the trail, only for a heartbeat. A man, I thought. Gray jacket, broad shoulders. He stood perhaps 60 meters ahead where the trail bent around a large cedar. I raised one hand automatically. "Hello?" The figure stepped behind the tree. I waited for him to emerge on the other side. He never did. Certain now that another hiker had been avoiding me for reasons unknown, I hurried forward, closing the distance in less than a minute. The cedar stood exactly where I expected. Behind it, there was nothing. No side trail, no fresh tracks, no movement through the underbrush. Only an empty stretch of trail disappearing uphill between silent trees. I walked a slow circle around the cedar, studying the ground carefully. The damp moss would have revealed recent passage immediately. There were no footprints, only mine. I remained there longer than I care to admit, trying to reconcile what I had seen with what now surrounded me. Perhaps it had been nothing more than overlapping shadows. Perhaps a broken trunk glimpsed from exactly the wrong angle. The human brain excels at assembling people out of incomplete shapes. I had written about that very phenomenon after wildfire smoke caused dozens of false missing person reports several summers earlier. Satisfied, though not convinced, I resumed walking. The trail climbed another 100 meters before leveling suddenly at the edge of a broad marsh hidden deep within the forest. The trees ended almost abruptly. Before me stretched a wide expanse of pale grasses, black pools of still water, scattered dead snags, and distant stands of alder shimmering beneath the overcast sky. No wind moved across it. Not even a ripple disturbed the water. The place felt abandoned by weather itself. A narrow boardwalk crossed the marsh, disappearing toward the far tree line, nearly half a kilometer away. At its entrance stood another sign. The lettering had faded almost completely. Someone had painted over it years ago. Someone else had scratched the paint away again. I stepped closer until I could finally make out the original carved words beneath the layers. Alder Flats. Then directly underneath, carved much later in smaller letters by a different hand, keep walking. Before I could examine it further, my recorder, still clipped to my shoulder strap, crackled unexpectedly. It had been switched off, I was certain of it. Yet through the tiny speaker came several seconds of static, followed by my own voice. Not the voice I had recorded a few minutes earlier. An older recording, one I had never made. It said only 6 words. I shouldn't have crossed the bridge. There are moments in a person's life when the impossible does not arrive with thunder or violence, but with something far quieter, something so small that the mind spends precious seconds trying to force it back into the ordinary world before finally surrendering. Standing at the entrance to the Alder Flats, staring at my recorder while my own voice calmly informed me that I should never have crossed the bridge, I experienced exactly that kind of surrender. It was not the message itself that frightened me most. Recorders malfunction, files become corrupted, electronics do strange things in damp weather. I had covered enough investigations involving faulty equipment to know that. What froze me where I stood was the voice. It was unquestionably mine, but it wasn't today's voice. There was an age to it that I could not explain, a roughness around the edges as though the man speaking had not slept properly for months. More unsettling still was the way he emphasized the word bridge, not dramatically, not fearfully, regretfully. It was the tone of someone describing a decision that had already ruined everything. I replayed the recording 3 more times, each repetition somehow making it worse, because with every listen I became more convinced that I was hearing not merely my own voice but my own habits of speech, the tiny pauses and breaths that no impersonator could possibly reproduce. By the 4th playback, the recorder clicked softly. The screen flickered once. and the file vanished entirely, leaving behind no evidence that it had ever existed except the memory settling like cold water into the bottom of my stomach. For several minutes I remained beside the weathered sign at the edge of the marsh, trying with increasing desperation to construct a version of reality that did not require impossible explanations. Someone could have tampered with the recorder before I arrived, though I had owned it for nearly a decade and kept it in the top drawer of my desk whenever it wasn't in use. A colleague might have played a practical joke, except no one in my newsroom knew I was driving to Blackwater Ridge until after I had already left Edmonton. Perhaps I had somehow recorded the message myself without remembering. Exhaustion can produce astonishing lapses in perception. I had been working long hours. I was sleeping poorly. My doctor had suggested reducing caffeine, though in fairness he had also suggested retirement, which seemed considerably less practical. One by one I examined every reasonable explanation available to me until only one fact remained stubbornly untouched. The message had referred to the bridge before I had crossed it. I knew that because I remembered checking the recorder while standing on the opposite bank. The timestamp confirmed it. Unless time itself had developed an interest in practical jokes, something had spoken from a future I had not yet lived. The alder flats stretched before me with an unsettling stillness that became more noticeable the longer I watched. Marshes are rarely silent. Frogs, insects, blackbirds, ducks. Wet places are usually crowded with small lives announcing themselves continuously. Yet this marsh seemed strangely incomplete. Pools of dark water reflected the gray sky with mirror-like perfection because nothing disturbed their surfaces. Pale grasses stood motionless despite the breeze I could still feel among the trees behind me. Dead spruce trunks rose from the wet ground like weathered gravestones, stripped of bark long ago until they appeared almost white against the darker vegetation. The boardwalk leading across the marsh had once been carefully constructed from thick cedar planks laid end to end over sturdy pilings, but years of moisture had blackened the wood, and several sections sagged noticeably where supports had begun sinking into the peat below. A small part of me admired the engineering. Another part wondered why the province continued maintaining a boardwalk across a trail it insisted nobody should use. I began walking. Each step produced a dull, hollow sound that traveled surprisingly far across the open marsh before fading into the surrounding alder. Unlike the forest, where trees absorbed noise, the flats seemed to carry it. My own footsteps echoed back from distant stands of shrubs with faint distortions that made it difficult to judge direction. Twice I stopped because I thought someone else had stepped onto the boardwalk behind me, only to realize I had been hearing my own movements return from somewhere ahead. I found myself unconsciously counting the planks beneath my boots, partly to occupy my thoughts, and partly because counting has always been one of those curious little habits people develop under stress. Soldiers count breaths, surgeons count instruments, journalists count facts. By the time I reached 187 planks, I noticed something odd about the handrails. At irregular intervals, someone had carved small arrows into the inside faces of the cedar, each pointing back toward the trailhead. Not decorative arrows, not official trail markers. Rough knife cuts, repeated again and again by different hands over many years. Some had almost disappeared beneath moss. Others looked comparatively recent. Every single one pointed in only one direction. Halfway across the marsh, I stopped to photograph another of the carvings and happened to glance down into the water beside the boardwalk. The peat-stained pool was remarkably clear despite its dark color. Thick roots twisted beneath the surface like enormous veins disappearing into the mud. For an instant I thought I saw another boardwalk running parallel beneath the water, several meters lower, perfectly preserved in the submerged darkness. I blinked. The image remained. Curious, I crouched carefully and leaned closer. It wasn't another boardwalk at all. It was the reflection of the one I stood upon, distorted by the stillness into something strangely deeper than it should have been. Yet as I continued staring, another reflection slowly appeared beside my own. Someone was standing behind me. I spun around so quickly that the recorder slapped against my chest. The boardwalk stretched away empty in both directions. No one, only the long line of blackened planks disappearing toward the forest I had left behind. I looked back into the water. The second reflection had vanished. My own face stared back at me, older than I liked to admit, framed by thinning gray hair and the permanent lines around my eyes, earned through decades of squinting into prairie wind, courthouse fluorescent lights, and politicians who insisted they had absolutely nothing to hide. I remained crouched there longer than I should have, studying the reflection until it became unmistakably ordinary again. Eventually I laughed under my breath, though the sound lacked conviction. Reflection, fatigue, poor light. Simple, entirely simple. I stood and continued walking. About 100 meters farther on, I noticed the first photograph. It had been tucked carefully between two loose boards near the edge of the walkway, protected from the weather beneath an overhanging plank. Time had curled its edges, but the image remained surprisingly clear. It showed a family standing beside the very gate I had entered earlier that afternoon. A man in a plaid jacket. A woman wearing an old Parks Canada windbreaker. Two young girls smiling broadly beneath matching wool toques. Judging by the cars in the background, the photograph had been taken sometime during the late 1980s. There was nothing unusual about it except its location. Who leaves a family photograph hidden beneath a boardwalk in the middle of a marsh? I turned it over. Written on the back in faded blue ink were 4 words. We came back 3. I read the sentence twice before understanding what unsettled me about it. Not we came back. 3. The number had no obvious purpose. Not the 3 of us. Not 3 days later. Simply, we came back 3. I slipped the photograph carefully into my notebook, intending to ask Gordon Vale about it later, though by then I was beginning to suspect there would be very few satisfactory conversations after leaving this trail. The boardwalk finally reached the opposite side of the marsh where the alders closed in once again, forming a narrow tunnel through which the path disappeared. Here the air felt noticeably colder than on the open flats. Moisture clung to every branch. The smell of stagnant water gave way to damp cedar and rich black soil. I had taken perhaps 20 steps beneath the canopy when I noticed another sign, smaller this time, mounted low against a cedar trunk. Unlike the others, it bore no official markings. Only one sentence had been carved into the wood. "They learn your voice first." I stared at the words, trying to decide whether they represented another elaborate attempt by hikers to frighten one another or something more deliberate. The cuts looked old. Moss had begun filling several of the letters. Whoever carved them had expected the warning to remain for years. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I nearly dropped it retrieving the device. 1 bar of signal. Impossible. The park had lost reception nearly an hour earlier. The screen displayed an incoming call. No number, no caller ID, only 1 word. Home. For one absurd heartbeat, I actually thought of answering. My wife, Anne, had died 4 years earlier after a short, brutally efficient battle with pancreatic cancer. Yet grief has a way of reaching for impossible hopes before reason can intervene. My thumb hovered over the screen. The phone continued ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Then, just before it stopped, voicemail activated automatically. The speaker crackled. For several long seconds I heard only static. Then Anne's voice, warm and unmistakable, spoke exactly the words she had said to me every morning for nearly 20 years before leaving for work. "Trevor, don't be late coming home." The line went dead. The signal disappeared. And somewhere deep within the alder thicket ahead of me, someone answered. "He's coming." I have often wondered whether places can possess schedules in the same way people do, whether certain valleys expect certain things to happen at certain hours, regardless of who happens to be standing there. Because by the time my phone fell silent and Anne's impossible voicemail dissolved into static, I found myself looking automatically at my watch rather than at the trees. It was 3:14 in the afternoon. 46 minutes until the gate closed. 46 minutes until Gordon Vale returned with his worn brass key to swing that heavy green barrier across the entrance to Alder Trail. Up to that point, I had been thinking like a journalist gathering evidence for a peculiar human story. Strange park policy, nervous employees, local folklore, practical jokes that had somehow grown into institutional tradition. But time itself had begun asserting a quiet authority over everything I experienced. Gordon had not warned me about sunset. He had not warned me about darkness. He had warned me about 4 o'clock, and the more I considered it, the more unsettling that became. Mountains do not care what hour it is. Bears certainly do not consult wristwatches. Only people, and perhaps things that had spent a very long time observing people, attach significance to clocks. I should have turned around immediately after hearing Anne's voice. There is no version of this story in which continuing deeper into the trail can be defended as sensible, and I have never tried to defend it. Yet journalism has always depended upon one dangerous assumption, namely that truth exists just beyond the next unanswered question. Every strange thing I encountered generated 2 more questions before it generated fear. How had anyone obtained Anne's voice? Why did the phone briefly regain signal only there? Who had carved those warnings into the signs? Why did they all seem less interested in describing danger than describing behavior? They learn your voice first. The sentence continued circling inside my mind as I stood among the dripping alders, listening to the silence settle once again over the trail. Whoever had written it had not chosen the word imitate. They had chosen learn. There is an enormous difference. One implies performance, the other implies intention. The path narrowed almost immediately beyond the warning sign, climbing gently through increasingly dense cedar where enormous roots crossed the trail like the backs of sleeping animals. Moss covered nearly every exposed surface, giving the forest an appearance of impossible age, as though nothing substantial had changed there for centuries. Even the air felt older somehow, cool and heavy with the smell of damp wood slowly surrendering itself to time. Several times I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, not because I expected to see anyone following me, but because I had developed the uncomfortable sensation that the forest behind me no longer resembled the one I had walked through only minutes earlier. The boardwalk across the marsh had vanished almost immediately from sight. The alder flats themselves seemed to have been swallowed by the trees with surprising speed. I knew they remained only a short distance behind me, yet already they felt strangely inaccessible, as though the trail preferred people to keep looking forward. Perhaps another 10 minutes passed before I noticed the ribbons. At first there was only one tied neatly around the branch of a young cedar beside the trail. Faded orange survey tape, weathered almost white by years of sun and rain, perfectly ordinary. Logging crews, biologists, search and rescue teams, they all leave flagging tape behind. Then I noticed another, and another. Within a few hundred meters, dozens of faded ribbons hung silently throughout the forest, each tied at shoulder height, each so old that the plastic had become brittle and curled. Curiously, they did not mark the trail itself. They pointed away from it, disappearing one after another into dense timber where no obvious route existed. I followed one line of ribbons with my eyes until they vanished among the cedars. Another line branched off in a completely different direction. It looked less like survey work than repeated attempts by different groups to mark separate paths back toward the trail. The realization arrived quietly. People had left these because they expected to become lost. I took several photographs before continuing. My recorder remained switched off now. I had no desire to discover what else it considered worthy of documenting. Instead, I relied on my notebook, though I found my handwriting deteriorating steadily with every page. The words leaned awkwardly downhill. Letters grew larger without my noticing. A psychologist might have found the progression fascinating. I merely found it irritating. I have always believed that neat handwriting reflects orderly thinking, and my thoughts had begun abandoning any pretense of order. I stopped beside a fallen cedar to rewrite one particularly illegible sentence when I heard footsteps approaching from farther up the trail. Real footsteps, measured, human, not echoes, not imagined. I stood immediately. The footsteps continued. Someone was definitely walking toward me. Relief arrived so suddenly that I almost laughed aloud. Another hiker. Perhaps one who had ignored the closure notices as casually as I had. Perhaps a photographer lingering too long among the autumn colors. Whatever the explanation, another ordinary person represented the first genuinely reassuring possibility I had encountered since crossing the bridge. I waited, rehearsing the questions I intended to ask. The footsteps stopped just beyond a bend, perhaps 30 meters ahead. I called out, "Hello?" Silence. "I heard you walking." Nothing. I waited another half-minute. Still nothing. Finally, I started cautiously toward the bend. The footsteps resumed. Only now, They were moving away from me, always remaining just beyond sight. I quickened my pace. The unseen walker did exactly the same, never running, never slowing, simply maintaining precisely the same distance. For nearly 5 minutes, we continued that peculiar dance through the cedars until frustration finally overcame caution. "Would you stop for a minute?" The footsteps ceased instantly. I rounded the bend. The trail stretched empty before me, no side paths, no fresh tracks, nothing. Only another warning carved into the trunk of an ancient cedar. This one consisted of a single sentence. "Don't follow the second person." I read it twice, then 3 times. Only gradually did the meaning begin settling into place. The first person had been the voice. The second had been the footsteps. My watch vibrated softly against my wrist. Not an alarm. Simply the hourly signal I had forgotten to disable months earlier. I looked automatically. 3:41 p.m. 19 minutes. The numbers struck me with unexpected force. I calculated the distance back to the gate almost instinctively. Even walking quickly, I would need at least 35 minutes. More if I stopped to investigate anything else. Somewhere in the back of my mind, another uncomfortable observation emerged. Every curious interruption since crossing the bridge had cost almost exactly 5 minutes. The recorder, the photographs, the mysterious caller, the footsteps, the carved warnings. Separately, they had seemed insignificant. Together, they had quietly consumed nearly an hour. Something wasn't merely frightening visitors. Something was delaying them. The thought had scarcely formed before I heard an engine. Faint, distant, behind me. A park truck. The sound drifted through the forest from the direction of the trailhead. I smiled despite myself. Gordon. He must have realized I had stayed too long and decided to drive in before locking the gate. The engine idled for several seconds. A truck door opened. Then Gordon Vale's unmistakable voice carried clearly through the cedars. "Trevor," I answered immediately. "Gordon." No reply. Instead, the engine started again, and slowly, very slowly, began driving deeper into the trail, away from the gate, away from the park, away from me. I stood listening until the sound finally disappeared altogether. Only then did I notice something that turned the relief inside me into something much colder. There were no tire tracks on the trail. The absence of tire tracks should not have frightened me as much as it did, because there are perfectly reasonable explanations for hearing engines in the mountains that leave no visible evidence. Sound carries strangely through valleys. Logging roads echo. A truck on a distant service road can seem close enough to touch when the wind is right. I knew all of that. I had written about it after wildfire evacuations, when exhausted residents insisted they had heard bulldozers operating in places where no machinery had ever been deployed. But reason was beginning to lose ground to accumulation, and accumulation is the real architect of fear. One impossible thing can be dismissed. 2 can be questioned. By the 10th or 11th, your mind quietly stops trying to explain the world and begins trying to survive it. I stood in the middle of Alder Trail, staring at undisturbed earth where heavy tires should have left deep impressions, listening to silence settle once more beneath the cedar canopy. And for the first time since entering the park, I admitted something I had resisted all afternoon. I no longer trusted my senses to agree with one another. My ears reported trucks. My eyes reported untouched ground. My phone had carried my dead wife's voice. My recorder had carried my own. Somewhere between those contradictions, the ordinary rules by which I had navigated both journalism and life had quietly stopped applying. I checked my watch again. 3:46 p.m. 14 minutes. The numbers seemed almost absurd now, like keeping score during an earthquake, yet I could not stop looking at them. Gordon Vale's warning had planted itself so deeply inside my thinking that every passing minute acquired unreasonable importance. I considered turning around immediately, abandoning every unanswered question, every photograph, every note, and simply walking back to the gate as quickly as possible. The decision lasted perhaps 3 seconds before another thought interrupted it. If I hurried now, if I covered the distance without another delay, I might still reach the trailhead shortly after 4. Gordon would probably still be there. I could ask him directly why he believed the hour mattered so much. That possibility steadied me just enough to begin moving again. Not deeper into the forest, I told myself. Back toward the bridge, back toward the gate, back toward ordinary explanations. I had not gone more than 100 meters when I noticed the notebook lying beside the trail. It rested against the exposed roots of an enormous cedar, as though someone had placed it there carefully rather than dropped it in haste. The cover had once been dark green, though years of damp weather had faded it almost gray. Moss crept across one corner, a leather strap still wrapped loosely around its middle. At first I assumed it belonged to another hiker who had accidentally lost it long ago. Such discoveries are not uncommon in backcountry parks. Water bottles, hats, maps, cameras if someone is particularly unlucky. But notebooks are different. They contain thoughts. They invite reading in a way abandoned backpacks do not. I hesitated only briefly before kneeling beside it. Impossible after so many seasons outdoors. I untied the strap and opened the cover. The first several pages were blank except for faint water stains, but farther in I found handwriting, careful block letters. Blue ink faded almost to purple with age. The entry carried a date, September 14th, 1998, nearly 3 decades earlier. The writer never gave a name, only observations. Trail closes tomorrow. Gordon says not to ask why anymore. I frowned. Gordon? The same Gordon Vale? I turned another page. He says they don't lock people out. Another. They lock something in. The words hung on the page with unsettling simplicity. No dramatic flourishes, no underlined warnings. Merely a sentence recorded by someone who apparently considered it worth remembering. I flipped ahead several pages. Most contained only short notes. Voices after the marsh. Never answer. Don't trust the footsteps. It remembers faces. Then, several pages later, the handwriting changed completely. The careful block letters became hurried, uneven, almost desperate. I saw my wife today. She has been dead 8 years. She knew things only Margaret could know. It wasn't her. I closed the notebook. Not because I wished to stop reading. Because I suddenly became aware that the forest around me had grown completely silent again. No dripping water, no distant ravens. Nothing, only my own breathing. Very slowly I looked up. The trail remained empty, yet something had changed. The cedar trunks surrounding me no longer appeared random. Several bore old scars where bark had peeled away decades earlier. Others leaned at curious angles. Together they formed what looked almost like a corridor, not the hiking trail, another one, running parallel through the forest. I followed it with my eyes until it disappeared among the trees. The ground there seemed strangely undisturbed despite the thick moss. No undergrowth, no fallen branches. Only a subtle open space weaving silently between the cedars, as though something very large had been using the same route for many years. A branch snapped. Not ahead, not behind. Beside me, perhaps 20 meters inside that hidden corridor. I turned immediately. Nothing moved. Then another branch broke. Farther along the same invisible path. Not random. Progressing. Something was walking parallel to me again. Exactly as the unseen footsteps had done earlier. Only this time there was no attempt to sound human. The weight was wrong. Each step carried a slow, deliberate heaviness that traveled through the forest floor before reaching my ears. Step, silence. Another step, closer. My heartbeat accelerated immediately. I backed onto the trail without taking my eyes from the corridor. The movement stopped. I waited. Nothing. 1 minute passed. Then, from somewhere ahead, perhaps 50 meters farther along Alder Trail, I heard pages turning, softly, deliberately, as though another notebook had just been opened. I looked toward the sound. No one stood there, only empty trail. The pages turned again, closer. Then a man's voice spoke quietly, not calling my name this time, reading aloud from a notebook. His voice was calm, measured, professional. It took me several seconds to recognize it. It was mine. September 14th, approximately 3:48 p.m. Found an abandoned notebook beside the trail. The voice paused exactly where I had paused while reading. Then continued, I think something is walking beside me. I stared down at the notebook in my own hands. The final pages fluttered open by themselves. There, written in ink so fresh it still glistened slightly, appeared words I had never written. September 12th, 3:49 p.m. I found the journal. If you're reading this, don't let it make you finish the story. I have spent much of my professional life believing that the written word possesses a kind of permanence the spoken word never quite achieves. Politicians deny conversations, witnesses misremember interviews, recordings become corrupted, but ink has a stubbornness that borders on arrogance. Once words are written, they sit patiently waiting for someone else to discover them years later. That belief carried me through countless investigations, and perhaps that is why the journal unsettled me more deeply than the voices ever had. Voices disappear into air. A journal remains. When I looked down at those final lines, dated with the very afternoon I stood there, written in handwriting that somehow resembled my own more closely with every passing second, I experienced something I had never before encountered in 55 years of living. My mind simply refused to continue. It was as though every familiar process of logic reached the edge of a cliff at exactly the same moment and found nothing beyond it. I stared until the ink stopped glistening, until it dried before my eyes exactly as fresh ink ought to dry. And somewhere inside me a quiet realization took root that frightened me far more than the words themselves. The journal wasn't predicting me. It was keeping pace with me. My first impulse was wonderfully ordinary. I tore the page out. Even now I smile at the memory because it reveals how desperately the human mind clings to simple solutions when confronted with impossible problems. If the words shouldn't exist, then remove them. Destroy the evidence. Break the chain somehow. The paper came free with surprising ease, the old binding crackling softly as the sheet separated from the rest of the notebook. I folded it once, then again, and stuffed it deep into the inside pocket of my jacket before closing the journal altogether. The action felt decisive, practical, almost satisfying. I even nodded to myself, absurdly pleased that I had interrupted whatever strange mechanism had produced the writing. Then I looked down. The notebook had another final page. I was certain it hadn't possessed one moments earlier. Slowly, with hands that no longer felt entirely steady, I opened it again. Fresh ink, fresh handwriting. You always tear out the first page. Below it, another sentence appeared as I watched. The letters formed one after another with agonizing slowness, the way fountain pen ink spreads into rough paper. It never helps. I dropped the journal. It landed open in the damp moss without closing, the unfinished sentence continuing to darken as though the page itself had been patiently waiting for me to witness it. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it lying there, to turn around and walk until the trail ended or the park gate appeared, or civilization reassembled itself into something recognizable again. Instead, I stood rooted to the spot, unable to look away, not because I wanted answers anymore. I had passed beyond curiosity. I simply could not convince myself that what lay on the ground was physically possible, and until I managed that, my legs refused to move. A breeze drifted quietly through the cedars. It was the first real wind I had felt in nearly an hour. The branches overhead stirred gently, releasing tiny drops of water that pattered softly onto leaves below. Somewhere a raven called once, then another answered from farther away. The ordinary sounds of the forest returned with such unexpected normality that I almost laughed from relief. Everything looked exactly as it had when I first entered Blackwater Ridge that afternoon. Moss, ferns, wet cedar trunks stretching upward into an overcast September sky. The impossible notebook lying beside the trail suddenly seemed almost theatrical against so much ordinary wilderness. Perhaps I had suffered some brief hallucination brought on by stress. Perhaps I had fallen without realizing it and struck my head. Perhaps. The notebook turned a page. No wind touched it. The page lifted slowly by itself, folded over, settled flat. I watched every movement. When it stopped, another sentence waited there. "You should leave now, Trevor." I backed away so quickly that my heel caught a root hidden beneath the moss. I stumbled hard against a cedar, bark scraping across my shoulder through the jacket, and only barely avoided falling. The notebook remained where it lay, open and silent once more, as though satisfied with what it had said. I did not pick it up again. Some instinct, older than reason, had finally begun asserting itself. There are moments when evidence ceases to be something worth collecting. This had become one of them. I turned and started back toward the bridge. Not hurriedly at first, simply walking. Every few steps I checked my watch. 3:53. 7 minutes. The mathematics no longer worked. Even if I jogged the entire distance, I would never reach the trailhead before Gordon closed the gate. That realization should have filled me with urgency. Instead, it filled me with a peculiar resignation. The gate itself no longer mattered nearly as much as remaining on the trail. Every carved warning, every handwritten note, every whispered voice seemed strangely united around that single instruction. Stay on the trail. Do not answer. Keep walking. None of them had suggested finding help. None had suggested fighting. Survival, apparently, depended upon obedience rather than courage. The cedars gradually opened as I descended toward the alder flats again. I felt genuine relief when the first pale grasses became visible through the trees. Open ground meant visibility. Visibility meant certainty. Whatever else happened, at least I would no longer be surrounded by trunks and shadows. I stepped out onto the boardwalk and stopped so abruptly that the old planks groaned beneath my boots. Someone stood halfway across the marsh. He faced away from me. Gray jacket, gray hair, average height, notebook tucked beneath one arm. For one impossible instant, I thought I was looking at my own reflection standing upright in the middle of the marsh. The man began walking, not away, toward me, slowly, calmly. His posture looked achingly familiar. The slight stiffness in the left shoulder from an old hockey injury. The habit of glancing briefly downward every few steps. Even the way he adjusted the strap of his shoulder bag. I knew those movements, because they were mine. I remained frozen while the figure continued approaching across the weathered planks. The distance between us narrowed steadily. 100 meters. 80. 60. His face remained indistinct beneath the flat afternoon light. Not hidden, simply difficult to focus upon. Then he stopped, perhaps 30 meters away. He raised one hand, not waving, pointing, past me, toward the forest behind. Very quietly he spoke. "Don't turn around." My heart began hammering so violently I could hear blood rushing inside my ears. There is something profoundly unnatural about being warned by your own voice. Every instinct demanded that I ignore him. Every instinct demanded that I obey him. I did neither. Instead, I stood perfectly still. The man smiled, not warmly. Then he looked past my shoulder. His expression changed immediately. The sadness vanished, replaced by something much older, much deeper. Recognition. Without another word, he stepped sideways off the boardwalk, into the black water. He did not splash. He did not sink. He simply disappeared beneath the surface as though the marsh had opened silently to receive him. The water became perfectly still again. Only then did I realize something. I had been so completely focused on the man that I had forgotten to listen. The forest behind me had gone absolutely silent. And from somewhere only a few steps beyond my back, I heard someone close my notebook. I have often thought that clocks are among humanity's greatest acts of optimism. We build our lives around the comforting belief that time behaves predictably, that 4 o'clock follows 3:59 with reassuring precision, that offices close, gates are locked, buses arrive, dinners begin, and the world quietly continues according to schedules we collectively agree upon. Standing halfway across the alder flats with my watch reading 1 minute past 4, I realized that Blackwater Ridge had its own understanding of time, one that had very little to do with ours. The instant the second hand swept past the 12, something invisible shifted around me. Not dramatically, not with thunder or an earthquake or some cinematic transformation of the landscape, but with the subtle certainty of a room whose occupants all stop talking the moment someone unexpected walks through the door. The air itself seemed heavier. Even the color of the afternoon changed, the pale September light flattening into a dull silver that erased depth and distance until the marsh, the boardwalk, the cedars, and the mountains beyond all seemed pressed together into a single silent painting. I remember thinking that if someone had looked into the valley from a helicopter at that moment, they would have seen nothing unusual at all. A lonely journalist standing on an old boardwalk in a provincial park. A perfectly ordinary autumn afternoon. The terrible thing about places like Alder Trail, I would later realize, is that they never advertise themselves to the outside world. Their secrets exist entirely within the experience of the people unfortunate enough to enter them. I did not turn around after hearing my own notebook close behind me. Every instinct begged me to. Every muscle across my shoulders tightened with the almost unbearable urge to spin around and confront whatever had been following me since crossing the first bridge. But another instinct had quietly grown stronger throughout the afternoon, fed by every carved warning, every faded journal entry, every impossible encounter. It was no longer telling me to understand what was happening. It was telling me to survive it. The other Trevor, the impossible man who had walked toward me across the boardwalk before stepping soundlessly into black water, had given me only one piece of advice, and somehow I trusted it more than anything else I had heard that day. Don't turn around. Those 3 words possessed the weight of experience rather than superstition. They sounded like the final lesson learned by someone who had paid dearly to discover it. So I remained facing the marsh while somewhere only a few feet behind me another version of my own life quietly breathed. For nearly a full minute, nothing happened. I became painfully aware of every tiny sound my body insisted upon making. My heartbeat seemed impossibly loud. My breathing felt coarse and intrusive. Even my jacket produced soft whispers whenever my chest expanded. The silence behind me possessed an intelligence that ordinary silence never carries. It did not feel empty. It felt occupied. Then, very softly, someone cleared their throat. It was the faintest sound imaginable. Little more than an unconscious habit before beginning a conversation. Yet I recognized it immediately because I had spent decades hearing it from the inside. I always cleared my throat before asking the first difficult question in an interview. Always. I had never noticed the habit until someone else performed it using my own voice. You stayed longer than I did. The sentence arrived quietly behind me, not threatening, not mocking, simply tired. The voice sounded older than mine, perhaps by only a few years, but enough that every word carried a roughness I did not yet possess. It was the voice of a man who had slept badly for a very long time. I closed my eyes without meaning to, listening while every rational part of my mind slowly accepted defeat. There was no hidden speaker, no prank, no elaborate recording hidden somewhere among the cedars. I knew my own cadence too well. The tiny pauses between phrases, the slight flattening of my vowels after hours of talking. Whoever stood behind me had not merely copied my voice, he had lived with it. I thought the gait mattered. The unseen speaker laughed quietly. It was not the laugh of someone amused. It was the laugh of someone remembering how naive he once was. The gate isn't for us. A coldness spread through my chest. Not because I understood what he meant, because I suddenly realized he believed he was helping me. That frightened me far more than if he had threatened violence. Ahead of me, the alder flats remained utterly motionless. Yet as I continued staring into the pale grasses and still black pools, I gradually became aware that I was no longer alone there either. At first I thought the changing light had begun playing tricks on my vision again. Gray shapes seemed to stand among the dead spruce scattered across the marsh, so faint they almost disappeared whenever I tried looking directly at them. Gradually, those shapes gathered definition. A woman in a red rain jacket stood beside one of the pools. Farther away, an elderly man wearing an old canvas fishing vest leaned lightly on a walking stick. Near the opposite end of the boardwalk, 2 children sat quietly on the railing with their legs dangling over the dark water. None of them moved, None acknowledged one another. They simply watched me with an expression I struggled to understand until I finally recognized it. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. Every one of them looked at me the way survivors sometimes look at newcomers arriving in a hospital waiting room, already knowing which conversation lies ahead without possessing the heart to begin it. More figures appeared as my eyes adjusted to the strange flat light. A young woman carrying a large hiking backpack. A park ranger wearing a uniform style discontinued decades ago. A middle-aged couple standing hand in hand near the far shore. They came from different years, different lives, different generations, yet all carried the same exhausted stillness about them. None spoke. None gestured. The entire marsh had quietly filled with silent witnesses whose attention never left the place where I stood. My first irrational thought was that they were ghosts, though the word itself seemed childish beside what I actually saw. They looked less like spirits than memories that had somehow forgotten to disappear. The voice behind me spoke again. "They looked at me, too." I remained absolutely still. I thought they wanted help. Another long silence followed. They were warning me. Without thinking, I looked at my watch. 4:07. Only 6 minutes had passed since the gate officially closed. It felt like an hour. The figures across the marsh began changing almost imperceptibly. One by one, they raised a single finger to their lips. The gesture spread through them without coordination, each person repeating the same silent movement until dozens of hands rested gently before unmoving mouths. It was not theatrical. It was practical. They were reminding me of something I already knew. Do not answer. Do not engage. Do not participate. Slowly, very slowly, the elderly man nearest the boardwalk lifted his walking stick and pointed toward the bridge behind me. Not urgently, calmly, simply indicating the direction I needed to travel. Keep walking. The instruction was so ordinary that it almost broke my heart. I took one careful step backward without turning. The boards creaked beneath my boot. Nothing happened. Another step. Then another. The unseen presence behind me matched every movement with astonishing precision, always remaining the same impossible distance away. I could hear nothing except an occasional shift of clothing and the faint sound of breathing. It wanted me to acknowledge it. I understood that now with absolute certainty. Every encounter since crossing the bridge had required my cooperation. The voices needed answers. The footsteps needed pursuit. The reflections required recognition. The trap did not spring until the victim voluntarily completed it. Halfway back across the marsh, the pressure surrounding me changed. It did not disappear. It simply eased, like a hand gradually lifting from someone's shoulder after resting there for a very long time. At exactly the same moment, the silent people scattered across the alder flats began fading into the landscape. Not vanishing suddenly, but becoming less distinct, their outlines dissolving into mist and pale grass until only one remained. The elderly woman in the red rain jacket. She smiled. It was a small, weary smile, the kind exchanged between strangers who have survived the same difficult winter. Then she mouthed two silent words. "Keep going." She disappeared. The marsh stood empty once more. I had nearly reached the bridge when another voice carried through the cedars ahead. "Trevor." I stopped instinctively. This voice belonged unmistakably to Gordon Vale, warm, solid, entirely ordinary. "You're cutting it close." I looked toward the trees where the trail entered the forest again. No one stood there. The voice came once more. "I waited for you." Everything inside me wanted to answer. To ask whether the gate had already been locked, whether he had found the journal, whether any of this had ever happened before. My mouth even opened. Then I remembered every warning carved into cedar, every desperate sentence written in faded ink, every silent face standing across the marsh only moments earlier. They had all said essentially the same thing: do not answer. So I closed my mouth, I lowered my eyes. And without saying a single word, I stepped onto the bridge. I have crossed enough bridges in my life to know that they possess a curious psychological quality entirely unrelated to engineering. A bridge is never simply a structure joining two places. It is a promise that one side can still reach the other. Standing at the entrance to the old cedar footbridge with Gordon Vale's voice drifting invisibly through the trees ahead, I realized that promise had quietly dissolved sometime during the afternoon. The bridge no longer represented the way back. It represented the place where before ended and after began. I cannot explain why that thought arrived with such certainty, only that once it did I found myself hesitating before placing my foot on the first weathered plank. Every warning I had discovered since entering Alder Trail had been written by people who had already crossed it. Every impossible event had happened beyond it. Somewhere behind me, the alder flats lay unnaturally still beneath the fading afternoon light, while ahead, the cedars waited in complete silence. I had the unmistakable sensation that the bridge itself had become interested in whether I would continue. The first few steps felt reassuringly ordinary. The old cedar planks creaked beneath my weight exactly as they had earlier that afternoon. Black water drifted lazily beneath the structure, reflecting broken patches of gray sky between overhanging branches. I concentrated deliberately on small, practical observations because ordinary details possess remarkable power over fear. The left railing leaned slightly inward where years of snow had bent one support post. Moss covered the shaded side of nearly every plank. A dragonfly rested briefly on the handrail before darting away into the reeds. I even found myself counting my footsteps again without realizing it, grateful for the familiar rhythm. 16 steps, 17, 18. The bridge had seemed surprisingly short when I crossed it the first time. Barely 30 paces from one end to the other. By 40 steps, I stopped counting. The opposite bank had not grown any closer. I frowned and looked behind me. The alder flats remained exactly where I had left them. The distance back appeared perfectly normal. Ahead, however, the far end of the bridge seemed strangely unchanged, still disappearing into the cedars at approximately the same distance it had occupied when I first stepped onto the planks. I told myself perspective can behave oddly in flat marshes. Uniform landscapes confuse the eye. Surveyors have documented such illusions for centuries. I resumed walking, this time paying closer attention. After another minute, I glanced down at my watch. 4:12. I should already have reached the opposite side. Instead, the bridge continued beneath my boots with quiet determination, its weathered planks stretching ahead exactly as before. I looked back again. The marsh had changed. Not dramatically, subtly. The figures who had vanished only moments earlier had returned. Not all of them, perhaps half a dozen. They now stood much closer to the boardwalk than before, scattered silently among the pale grasses, watching with the same exhausted expressions that had haunted me across the flats. None attempted to follow, none gestured, they simply observed. Then one of them did something unexpected. The elderly woman in the faded red rain jacket slowly shook her head. Not at me, at the bridge. The movement lasted only a second before she became still again. I turned forward immediately. The far end remained impossibly distant. The realization arrived quietly, almost gently. I wasn't crossing the bridge anymore. The bridge was crossing me. The thought made so little sense that I almost laughed aloud, yet the more I considered it, the more accurately it described the strange sensation surrounding me. My feet continued moving. The planks continued passing beneath my boots. Time continued advancing according to my watch. Yet nothing else changed. It felt less like travel than participation in some process whose outcome had already been decided. Then I heard footsteps. Not behind me. Ahead? Someone else was walking toward me. They sounded human, measured, calm. The bridge prevented me from seeing more than 30 or 40 meters ahead because the cedar branches crowded low over both sides, creating alternating curtains of shadow and pale light. Whoever approached remained hidden beyond those shifting screens, though their pace matched mine almost perfectly. One step, another. The distance between us should have closed rapidly. It didn't. The footsteps remained exactly the same distance away, neither approaching nor retreating, as though the unseen walker occupied another version of the same bridge. The memory of the warning carved beside the trail returned with startling clarity. Don't follow the second person. Until that moment, I had assumed it referred to the invisible footsteps leading me through the cedars earlier in the afternoon. Now I wondered whether I had misunderstood completely. The footsteps stopped. A long silence followed. Then a familiar voice drifted softly through the branches. Trevor. Not Gordon, not Anne. My father. He had died 11 years earlier after a stroke left him unable to speak during his final months. Yet here his voice emerged exactly as I remembered it from childhood, deep and slightly rough from years of smoking before my mother finally forced him to quit. I had not heard that voice in over a decade, yet recognition came instantly. You're walking too fast. Should have, because they were something he had said repeatedly during fishing trips when I was a boy, forever hurrying ahead along riverbanks while he carried the tackle box behind me. I closed my eyes. The bridge creaked softly beneath my boots. I've been waiting. I kept walking. Every instinct begged me to answer. To ask one impossible question. To hear his voice once more. Instead, I lowered my head and fixed my eyes on the weathered planks passing beneath my feet. One, another, another. The footsteps ahead resumed, still matching mine, still impossibly distant. Minutes seemed to stretch strangely upon that bridge until I no longer trusted my watch. When I finally risked another glance upward, I saw something that emptied the remaining warmth from my body. Carved into the handrail beside me were names, hundreds of them. Some almost erased by decades of weather, others surprisingly fresh, each accompanied by a date. The names continued in both directions as far as I could see, filling every available section of cedar with careful knife cuts. Some bore only initials, others full names. Many had small lines scratched through them, not crossed out, completed. Near shoulder height, I found another carving, larger than the rest, more deliberate. It consisted of a single sentence. The bridge only ends if you keep walking. My breathing caught. Beneath those words carved so recently that pale cedar still showed beneath the cuts, appeared another line. Don't stop to read this. I had already stopped. The realization arrived at exactly the same instant the bridge fell silent. No creaking, no footsteps, no breeze, nothing. I looked slowly ahead. For the first time since stepping onto the bridge, I could finally see the far bank. It stood no more than 10 meters away, waiting, between two enormous cedars. Someone stood there, not moving, watching me. He wore my jacket, carried my shoulder bag. His notebook rested beneath one arm, and as our eyes met across those final few meters, as though I had finally arrived to take his place. There are moments when the human mind makes a quiet decision without asking permission from the person who happens to own it. Looking across those final meters of weathered bridge at the man wearing my jacket, carrying my notebook, and smiling with the unmistakable relief of someone whose long wait had finally ended, I understood with absolute certainty that I would not step off the bridge while he remained standing there. I cannot explain how I knew this. There was nothing grotesque about him. His face was mine, only older by perhaps 5 or 6 years. His hair had thinned a little more. His shoulders sagged with a tiredness I recognized from my own reflection after covering long election nights or wildfire evacuations. Even his smile was familiar. It was the weary, polite smile I had learned to wear during interviews with officials who believed they could outlast difficult questions. Yet behind that expression lived something profoundly wrong. He did not look like a man who had survived. He looked like a man who had been surviving for so long that he had forgotten what ordinary living felt like. The relief in his eyes was not the relief of rescue. It was the relief of replacement. Neither of us moved for what felt like an impossibly long time. The bridge had become completely still beneath my boots. The marsh behind me frozen into a silence so complete that I could hear individual drops of water falling from cedar branches somewhere far below. The man continued watching me with extraordinary patience. Eventually he nodded once, almost encouragingly, the way one might reassure a nervous child standing at the edge of a swimming pool. Then he spoke. You've done well." His voice was mine. Not merely similar. Mine exactly. The tiny rasp that appeared whenever I had been talking for several hours. The slight flattening of the word well that Anne used to tease me about. Every detail. I remained silent. He seemed pleased by that. "You've learned not to answer." Another nod. "That's farther than I got." The sentence settled over me with quiet horror because it carried no deception. Every word sounded sincere. Whoever, or whatever, stood at the far end of that bridge genuinely believed we shared the same experience. It wasn't pretending to be me anymore. It believed it was me. I looked briefly over my shoulder. The bridge behind me stretched back across the alder flats exactly as I remembered, though the marsh itself seemed strangely farther away than before. The silent figures still waited among the pale grasses, but now they appeared almost transparent against the gathering evening light, as though daylight itself had begun carrying them away. The elderly woman in the faded red rain jacket remained visible longer than the others. She caught my eye and very slowly, almost imperceptibly, shook her head. Not at me, at him. I turned forward again. The man had not moved. His smile remained patient. "I know what you're thinking." I believed him. "You think if you don't come closer?" He glanced briefly at the bridge beneath his boots. "Nothing changes." His eyes returned to mine. "But that's not how this place works." The wind stirred gently for the first time in what felt like hours, carrying the rich scent of wet cedar and autumn leaves across the marsh. Somewhere overhead a raven called once before falling silent again. The ordinary sounds of the world were returning, but they seemed strangely distant, like noises drifting through the walls of another room. I forced myself to speak. It was the first word I had willingly uttered since stepping onto the bridge. "Who?" My throat tightened. "Are you?" The question escaped before I could stop it. The instant the final syllable left my mouth, I regretted it. Not because he answered, because the bridge reacted. A low groan traveled through the weathered cedar beneath my boots, spreading from one end to the other like an enormous structure awakening after a long sleep. Every carved name along the handrail seemed suddenly sharper. The air itself felt heavier. The man's smile disappeared, not replaced by anger, by disappointment. "You answered." His words carried genuine sadness. I always do. The bridge shifted, only slightly, enough that I instinctively widened my stance. The water below remained perfectly still. No ripples, no wind, only the bridge itself moving. The man sighed. "I hoped maybe this time." He stopped speaking. His attention drifted beyond me toward the marsh. Something behind me had changed. I refused to turn. His expression hardened for the first time. "They're watching." Another sigh. "They always watch." He looked back at me. "You should have kept walking." The sentence struck me with peculiar force, not because of what it meant, because I suddenly realized he wasn't threatening me. He was giving advice, too late, exactly as every carved warning, every journal entry, every silent gesture throughout the trail had arrived too late. I lowered my eyes to the bridge. The names carved into the handrail continued beside me. Dozens, hundreds. Without thinking, I began reading them. One belonged to a school teacher from Prince George whose disappearance I vaguely remembered covering 20 years earlier. Another belonged to a university student reported missing during a solo backpacking trip in the early 90s. Then I found a name I recognized immediately: Len Harker. My breath caught. The retired conservation officer who had called me only yesterday. Beneath his name, someone had carved a date. 23 years earlier. Impossible. Len had spoken to me on the telephone. He had given me directions. He had laughed. Slowly, almost unwillingly, my eyes traveled farther down the cedar. Another name.
Gordon Vale.
Another old date. Long before the truck. Long before the warning at the gate. The world around me seemed to tilt. If those names belonged here, who had I spoken to? The man at the end of the bridge answered the question I had not asked aloud. "They always come back." The words echoed strangely across the marsh. They have to. I looked toward the fading figures again. The elderly woman had vanished. Only empty grasses remained. The bridge suddenly felt much colder beneath my boots. Did his notebook from one arm to the other. You've almost figured it out. His voice had become softer now. So I'll save you the last part. He raised one finger and pointed beyond me, toward the trailhead. The gate doesn't close to keep people out. A long pause followed. It closes. He smiled again, because after 4, another pause. The trail begins leaving. For one bewildering instant, I failed to understand. Then I heard it, not ahead, not behind. The unmistakable sound of the forest moving. Not trees swaying, the entire forest. Cedars creaked. Roots groaned deep beneath the marsh. Somewhere distant, stone scraped slowly against stone. The landscape itself had begun rearranging. The trail wasn't disappearing, it was going somewhere. And everyone who remained on it was going with it. I used to believe that every investigation ended one of 2 ways. Either you discovered the truth or you discovered that the truth had never existed in the first place. Those seemed like the only honest conclusions available to a journalist. What happened on Alder Trail taught me there is a third possibility, one I had never considered because no newsroom, no editor, no journalism school ever prepares you for it. Sometimes you discover the truth, and the truth has no interest whatsoever in being published. It simply wants to be witnessed. Standing on that endless bridge while the cedars groaned and the marsh itself seemed to shift beneath a sky that had forgotten how afternoon light was supposed to behave, I finally understood why every warning I had found along the trail felt incomplete. None of the people before me had failed to explain what was happening because they lacked words. They had failed because explanation no longer mattered. Once you reached that bridge after 4 o'clock, the only thing left worth saying was, keep walking. Every other sentence arrived too late. The deep groaning continued beneath the earth with a slow mechanical rhythm that reminded me of the hull of a ship settling against a dock. Except there was no ship, no dock, and no ocean anywhere within hundreds of kilometers. The sound seemed to come from the roots of the forest itself. Cedar trunks leaned almost imperceptibly. The black pools of the alder flats rippled for the first time since I had entered them, though there was still no wind. Even the mountains beyond the marsh appeared subtly different, not moving in any dramatic sense, but rearranging themselves by tiny degrees that only became noticeable because I had been staring at them for so long. The impossible man standing at the far end of the bridge watched all of it with the calm resignation of someone who had already witnessed the process countless times. He no longer smiled. He no longer attempted conversation. He simply waited, as though he understood that no further persuasion would be necessary. Whatever decision remained belonged entirely to me. I looked down at the weathered planks beneath my boots and noticed something I should have seen much earlier. Tiny gaps separated many of the cedar boards where years of weather had shrunk the wood. Through those narrow cracks I could see not water but darkness. Not the dark brown water of the marsh. Something deeper. Curious despite everything, I crouched slowly and placed one eye near the largest opening between 2 planks. What I saw below has remained with me more vividly than anything else from that day. And even now I struggle to describe it honestly because honesty makes it sound impossible. There was another bridge beneath mine. Not directly beneath, far below. It stretched through darkness until distance erased it completely, identical in every detail except for its age. Hundreds of figures walked silently across it, all moving in the same direction, none speaking, none looking up. Some carried backpacks, others held fishing rods, cameras, notebooks, walking sticks. Ordinary people. They walked with the exhausted patience of commuters who had forgotten there was ever another destination. Then, farther below still, I glimpsed another bridge, and beneath that another. Layer upon layer disappearing into blackness, each carrying its own endless procession of hikers, crossing forever toward destinations they would never reach. I stood so quickly that the bridge lurched beneath me. The man waiting ahead nodded once. "You looked." It was not accusation, only confirmation. I looked too. The simplicity of that sentence nearly undid me. Everything about Alder Trail suddenly arranged itself into a pattern so obvious I wondered how I had missed it. The voices, the reflections, the journal, Gordon, Len, Anne, my father. None of them had been trying to lure me deeper into the forest. They had all been trying to make me stop walking long enough to look away from the only thing that mattered. The trail had not been hunting people. It had been teaching them to participate. Every distraction, every impossible encounter, every mystery invited one small decision after another until eventually, the hiker forgot the simplest survival rule ever carved into those cedars. Keep walking. Not because the trail led home, because stopping allowed the trail to change around you. The realization struck with astonishing clarity. I had stopped dozens of times, to photograph, to investigate, to read, to listen, to ask questions. I had done exactly what a journalist spends his entire life doing. The trail had not defeated me despite my profession. It had used it. Behind me came the unmistakable metallic sound of a gate closing. I knew immediately that it could not possibly be the gate at the trailhead. It stood kilometers away. Yet the sound carried across the marsh with perfect clarity. A heavy hinge. Steel meeting steel. Then the slow turn of an old brass key inside a weathered lock. The man at the far end lowered his eyes. It's beginning. I looked back over my shoulder. For the first time since stepping onto the bridge, the alder flats had disappeared, not hidden by fog, gone. Behind me stretched another section of bridge leading into darkness where no marsh had ever existed. The cedars bordering the path had become taller than before, their trunks disappearing upward beyond sight while their roots seemed to sink into blackness instead of earth. The air smelled different as well, no longer wet leaves and autumn rain, older somehow, like libraries closed for centuries, like abandoned churches, like places where memory had remained long after people left. Something inside me finally broke. Not courage, certainty. I understood then that there would be no investigation, no article, no interview with Gordon Vale waiting at the trailhead. There was only one remaining choice. Keep walking, or stop forever. I tightened the straps on my shoulder bag, tucked the notebook securely beneath my arm, and began walking. Not toward the man. Past him. He stepped quietly aside without resistance. As I passed, he spoke one final sentence. "When you reach the gate." I slowed. "Don't tell them." I looked at him. His face had already begun changing. Not into anything monstrous. Into mine. The version of me that had entered the park only yesterday morning. Curious, confident. Carrying a notebook full of empty pages. Then he smiled sadly and walked onto the bridge behind me. Taking my place. I never saw him again. The next thing I remember is sunlight. Bright, ordinary September sunlight warming the hood of my Subaru in the Alder Trail parking lot. I was sitting behind the steering wheel with the engine idling. My notebook rested on the passenger seat beside me. My camera lay on the floor where it had apparently fallen. My watch read 4:18. Only 18 minutes had passed. The gate stood open. No parked truck. No Gordon Vale. No sign anyone else had been there all afternoon. For several long minutes, I simply sat listening to the engine while trying to understand how I had returned to my vehicle without remembering the walk. Eventually, I opened the notebook. Every page was blank, except the last one. Written neatly in my own handwriting were 12 words. Temporary closure, effective 4 p.m. Reopens when someone else asks why. I drove straight back to Edmonton without stopping once. The following morning, I called the number Len Harker had used. It had been disconnected for 17 years. I contacted Parks Canada, the provincial archives, and eventually even the old newspaper where I began my career. Gordon Vale had indeed worked at Blackwater Ridge Provincial Park. He retired in 1998. He died the following winter. Len Harker had served as a conservation officer until 2009. His obituary appeared in a local paper the previous spring. Neither man could possibly have spoken to me. I never published the story. Not because no one would believe it, Because I eventually discovered something that convinced me silence was the last responsible act left to me. Every September, on the second Friday after Labor Day, the provincial park quietly posts the same laminated notice at the entrance to Alder Trail. Temporary closure. No explanation, no reopening date, just as it has for decades. And every year, without fail, someone ignores it. A photographer, a backpacker, a university student, a retired couple looking for a quieter trail. Someone curious enough to wonder why one ordinary path through an ordinary Canadian forest always closes at exactly the same time every autumn. Sometimes they return before dark. Sometimes they return after. And sometimes they come back carrying notebooks filled with perfectly blank pages, except for the last one. That is why I am telling you this story now. Not so that you will believe me, not even so that you will avoid Blackwater Ridge. Only because one day you may find yourself standing before a weathered green gate in a beautiful provincial park, looking at a simple laminated sign that says temporary closure. And you will remember a journalist named Trevor Saberlund who once spent his entire career asking questions other people preferred not to answer. On that day, I hope, for your sake, you choose the one thing I never did. I hope you keep driving.